Module 3, we're moving on to analysing a legal problem. This is how you take a problem and turn it into a solution. How you take the different strands that we looked at last week of the debate and weave them into a final research paper. It's fundamentally connected to the concept of writing. And it may seem a little strange at this point that we're talking about writing before the research is done, but I think one of the things we hope to do, or I hope to do this week, is to debunk that myth that these are two separate stages, that you go away and research and you read and read and read, then you stop and you go and write. These two processes are inextricably linked. Alright, so the readings this week, the first reading is there for revision. Hopefully there's nothing terribly new in there for you, and it talks about the different sorts of legal sources. This is the sort of thing that you will have covered in first year, so don't feel as though you're taking a step backwards. It's there to remind you, and there might be bits and pieces and details in there that you've forgotten, so it's there purely to remind you of where you've been. The second reading is also connected to first year, but it looks critically at the idea of IRAC or HIRAC or MIRAC or any of those things, which is a technique we use as sort of training wheels to teach beginning students how to analyse legal problems, but it has its limits. And in this subject, you're really earning your P plates. You're moving beyond that, and one of the things you need to be able to do is to critically look, as this selection of different pieces does, at the problems with using IRAC, and to start figuring out for yourself, well, how do I go about solving problems? How can I build on that? Alright, this week in Navigating the Law, we look at two key sources, textbooks and encyclopedias, which are really the starting point of your research. Again, this is kind of backwards to the way in which law textbooks usually try and explain legal research. They deal with the primary materials up front, and we'll be looking at those over the next few weeks, but they don't start where you actually start in the research process, which is the basics. And these are the areas that amalgamate information, they aggregate information, they summarize information, and at least until the point at which they're published, are reliable starting points for you to then find out what those other authorities are. Legal encyclopedias are good for filling in the gaps after textbooks have been published, but they have kind of their own difficulty, which we will talk about in class. They're a fantastic resource when you know how to use them, but the learning curve is really steep. The way they're formatted doesn't really do you any favours, particularly if you're used to sort of Wikipedia with, I want to find the answer, there it is. It can be very confounding when you start using legal encyclopedias. That being said, it's absolutely essential that you know how to do it. And maybe one of you guys is going to be the person who actually fixes these encyclopedias and comes up with a way to make them much more user-friendly, because someone's got to do it sometime soon. All right. The workshop this week, again, returns to that concept of examining a problem in depth. Last week we looked at looking at debates and actually pulling out the pros and cons of different points in a legal problem. Here we look at how you actually try and weave those points of view into a cohesive whole. And we think about how you actually establish a through line or a backbone through a paper, where your argument has a beginning, middle, and an end. That's really obvious. Everyone tells you to do that. But there needs to be this continual line throughout what you write, that each paragraph, each sentence is pushing the thesis forward a little bit further. It's explaining, it's clarifying, it's using evidence. And a big part of that is using those different arguments and being able to say, A says this, B says this, C says this. I'm going to examine each of one of those things, each of those positions, and I'm going to argue based on the evidence of the strength and merits of those positions, a final result. And as I said at the start, this writing process is not something which is separate from the research reading process, although we often tend to do it that way, much to our cost. If we're actually creating this analysis as we go, we can identify where the weak spots are in our argument before it's too late. And we can go, you know what, I really need a piece in here that fits this piece of the puzzle. We also avoid duplicating research. Once we already have enough on a particular area, and when we've done our analysis, we know we don't need any more on it. And we simply need to be able to be conscious of where we're going in the writing process as we go when we're reading. And again, this is something which is not taught very often. It certainly is something that is a common problem among law students, even at the upper year levels, that there isn't an opportunity. Hopefully here's an opportunity, but until now there hasn't been an opportunity for you to sit down and think, well, what is good writing? How do I write? What are the things I do well when I write? What are my weaknesses? And you use metaphor a lot for this because it's hard to describe, but the idea of weaving and the idea of taking these threads and weaving them into whole cloth, I think, is a good one, and is very different from an approach many people take, which I think the analogy there might be the shotgun approach, where you load up everything that you've got, you throw it at the page, and you hope that something's going to hit something important. And unfortunately, we see that way too often. And we see a lot of people who constantly stumble as law students because they don't have an analytical approach to the way they solve problems. So how do you get better at writing? Well, there's a very common answer in any of the literature on writing. You get better at writing, of course, by practicing in a critical way, by writing a lot, reviewing it, getting other people to review it, and thinking about it. And just think, have you ever done that? Have you ever shown someone a paper, an assignment, and said, tell me about the writing. Don't tell me about whether the answer's right or wrong. Tell me about the writing and the way I write, the clarity of the ideas, the persuasiveness. We don't often do that. But, okay, writing is something you get by practice, but the other really important thing about writing that comes out of the advice of many people is reading. Reading, doing lots of reading. Doing reading that's critical, not passively reading, not sitting under a tree and going, this is lovely, and reading, but reading actively, looking at the sentence structure, looking at the way in which someone writes, looking at the way they sequence, the way in which they organize ideas. And not just in law, look at other disciplines. Look at fiction, look at poetry, look at IKEA instructions, look at game rules, look at screenplays. Read absolutely everything, and read critically. Read with a view to understanding the craft of writing and the decisions that person made when they chose to put those words down in that particular order. So a big task, and it's something we're not going to be able to achieve in 12 weeks. We're not going to all become master writers in 12 weeks. But you can get much better at writing very quickly by being conscious of these things, by being aware of writing as a thing, that writing is not a transparent process where you merely take the things in your head and put them on the page, that writing is actually a craft where you're actually designing sentence structure, you're designing paragraph structure, you're putting these things together into a whole. And that's a lifelong learning thing. So we're getting started here, but it's one of those things that you set your goals and you get a little bit better at it every day. And every time you get a little bit better, you get better results, you get better research, and I think it's safe to say you're going to do better in all your academic studies the better you become at that writing and the better you become at that problem analysis aspect.